Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you to this meeting on rebalancing the European economy, where we are honored to, to host the launching of this report from the CESIfo Institute, the European Economic Advisory Group. I believe the report has now been on your website for 2 minutes. So it's really a launch event. And as you can see, we have here 4 people on the podium. First of all, my apologies to our guest from the European Commission, Anne Boucher, where her name tag is in preparation. Again, my apologies, it will come. But as I said, the main point today is to give 2 main authors of the report an occasion to present their report, which I think you have seen outside, and of which generously you have been given the occasion to take a copy. And I propose that we limit the presentation, if you can, to 30, 40 minutes really max between the 2 of you, so that we have some time to comment on them, and then hopefully involve you, the audience, as well with question and answers. We have one limit, which is 2:30 fix. We will finish at that time, I can promise you. And therefore, without further ado, I will give the floor first to Professor Jan-Egbert Sturm. He is the director of the Koch Institute in Switzerland. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. It's a pleasure being here, and it's a pleasure to present already here our 12th report which we've produced. This year the report is around the topic rebalancing Europe. We're in the middle of a process. The question is, how far are we in the middle? Is it more in the start, or is it already in the second half? That's not quite clear. We'll be talking about this during this particular event here, but of course more details you can find in the report itself. So the members of the people behind this particular report I will shortly mention here. It's first of all Giuseppe Bettola. He is our Italian representative, so to speak, but he's currently active in France. John Driffel from the University of London, who is, like Giuseppe, quite an expert on, in particular, labor market issues. Then we have Harold James from Princeton University on board. He brings more the outside view into the picture, and I think we can learn also quite a lot from the US experience in history, so to speak, and probably Hans-Werner Sinn later on is also going to talk a bit on that. Then Hans-Werner Sinn, who's also here and will also present part of a report to you. Then myself as a current chairman of this group, and then finally Arcos Valentini, who knows quite a bit about, in particular, Eastern European countries, which is also pretty helpful if you want to create an overview of what's going on in Europe. All right, the topics of this year's report are split up, as usual, in first of all, a part on the macroeconomic situation and the forecast for the current year. Then we have a chapter 2 on European imbalances, a 3rd chapter on labor market issues, because as you can see what's happening in Europe, that labor unemployment rates are shooting up, in particular southern European countries. One can imagine that these will be topics which are heavily being discussed there. And then, as already indicated, we try to learn a bit from the history of the United States and see what that can mean for Europe as a whole. I'll talk basically about the forecast, about the economic situation, the current situation of the world economy, and in particular Europe, and then Hans-Werner Sinn is going to go in more detail with respect to the European imbalances and also with regard to what we can learn from the United States. All right, so as promised, the macroeconomic outlook. One way of looking at the world is looking at it via the industrial production side, seeing how industrial production has evolved over the last couple of years. Industrial production is pretty important for total production in the economy, and it's also quite cyclical. What you see here is the level of industrial production as being published by the CPB, Netherlands Bureau of Economic Policy Analysis. They have a world trade monitor, and part of that monitor is also trying to collect industrial production figures for basically the entire world, and this is the aggregate figure of that. What one can see very clearly is the drop in the beginning of the crisis in 2008, 2009, and also the very shift recovery which we saw around the world, but also, and that's basically the picture of, in particular, last year, a rather flat development. If you look at the growth rates and you split up the total dynamics into the group emerging and developing countries, which is the light bar, so to speak, and you compare that to what happened in the more advanced world, so that's basically the OECD or the United States, Japan, and Europe, then one can see that the contribution clearly has differed. And if one looks at the last couple of months for which data is available, in particular the autumn of last year, then one can see that indeed industrial production actually shrunk in the Western world, whereas it gained some dynamics at least in the emerging countries. Well, this is basically setting the picture of where we are, basically a Western world which is, at least in Europe, in quite some distress, but also the United States is certainly not healthy as it was before the crisis. And on the other hand, the emerging countries, which seem to be coping relatively well at least, and seem to be, at least to some extent, even the engine for the world economy currently. The last figure here, so the December values for industrial production actually for the first time showed a little bit of light also for the Western economies, and we hope that this trend can at least to some extent proceed into the next year, but I'll talk about that in a minute. The EEAG Institute also surveys not only German businesses about the situation, you all probably know of the EEAG Business Climate Index, but they also survey experts in around 110 countries around the world, and there they also ask about how do you assess the current economic situation in your particular country. And these questions can also be aggregated and again to a world level, or at least to a regional level. And here I show you some results with regard to how do these experts assess the current situation in the world. Here you see the assessment for North America. It's still below the average line, so to speak. So the situation is certainly underperforming. The United States is still underperforming concerning from the perspective of these survey participants. For Latin America, we also have seen that during the course of the year 2012, there has been a little bit of a slowdown in economic activity and also in this economic sentiment indicator. The same holds very clearly for Asia, where China basically reduced its pace, especially in the first half of last year. Currently, it seems to be regaining some momentum again. And then finally, Europe, and it's quite obvious also from this graph, Europe is the country which is most troublesome for the entire world economy. This is with regard to the economic assessment, so the current situation. The same survey also about how do you assess the future for the upcoming half year, so what are the prospects in the short run. And there, actually, there is a bit more light. Basically, also in North America, already for quite some time, there were more people there, more participants who agree that probably it's going to become better than it has been so far. Yes. If you look at the sentiment in Latin America, then clearly we see an upward trend already over a few quarters here. The idea is that indeed there is more light at the end of this long tunnel. And the same holds for Asia. I already said China. China is actually gaining momentum again, and also other countries in the region are doing better than a few months or a few quarters ago. And we do observe that also in the sentiment there is the expectation that the upcoming year will see a little bit of increased dynamics. And finally, Europe, even there, around the turn of the year, we've seen clearly a mood change in many sentiment indicators, also this one. So if you aggregate these regional survey results to the world level, then one gets this EEAG World Economic Climate Indicator. And as you can see, in the course of last year, it was more or less on a, well, quite moderate from a longer term perspective level. It currently seems to have regained a little bit of momentum. If you hold this next to actual growth dynamics according to the IMF, these are IMF growth rates using purchasing power parity ideas in the background, then you can see that indeed these survey participants do get the overall tendency pretty well. Yes. According to our forecast, and partly backcast, so to speak, last year we've probably seen a growth rate of only 3% on the world level, and as you can see from a historical perspective, that was actually not very high. For the running year, we do expect a little bit of increased dynamics. It will increase to 3.3%, but even that is still, from a historical perspective, of course, a very low figure. Yes. All right. If one wants to see where this growth is stemming from, so is this Europe, is this Asia, is this the United States, North America, then the next graph is probably very helpful. Here I basically show the GDP growth rates again. However, this time these are not PPP adjusted figures, but these are market rates. Yes, that actually lowers the growth rate quite substantially. According to our backcast, so to speak, we've seen growth of 2.3% last year, and we expect this year to grow by 2.5%. Note the figure is obviously lower than before, simply because especially the emerging markets gets a lower weight, and overall these markets show clearly higher growth rates. Where does this growth come from? If you look back into history, then you can see clearly that there has been a change over time. Initially, 2003, 2004, 2005, we saw relatively large growth contributions coming from particularly North America, which is the US, but also from Europe. And at least these two large parts of the world sum up together to be clearly bigger than the Asian growth contribution. That has changed since the crisis, and also in our forecast, it's basically the yellow bar here, the yellow part, which shows most dynamics, although these are market rates. Remember, if I would have used PPP adjusted figures, then the yellow bar would even be bigger, relative terms, yes. So what we can see here is, according to our forecast, we basically still see no growth contribution coming from Europe. It was slightly negative last year, it's slightly positive this year, but you have to have good eyes to see a little tiny blue bars. Yes. United States does have something to contribute to the world from this perspective, although this year we'll actually see somewhat lower growth than previous year, basically because of the fiscal consolidation efforts which are going on there. But as you can see, the main growth contribution is indeed coming from the Asian part of the world, and also Latin America is playing at least some role. If you look at individual countries, then here we basically see the US forecast together with the Japanese forecast and the forecast for the European Union. We basically, for the European Union, have a growth forecast of 0.1% in this particular year. And I also confront this with China, which you have to read on the right-hand side scale. China, of course, doesn't grow with 0%, but it's more or less 9%, which is our forecast. So if you look at the figures for 2013, the United States will, according to our forecast, grow with 1.6% after having a growth rate of 2.2% last year. And the European Union now has a plus sign in front of it, but it's still a very, very meager number, of course. It's basically a stagnation. China is coming back again with growth rates of around 9%. An aspect which has become more of interest in recent times is exchange rate developments around the world, in particular of Japan. Now that we've seen a policy change there, also a new election of a central bank president. And I think exchange rates, not only in the world, have become more of interest to economists and politicians, but later on we will see also implicitly the problems within Europe revolve around effective prices, effective exchange rates, which are implicit within the euro area nowadays. Here we see that the United States exchange rate basically has depreciated from a normalized figure of 100 in 2007, so a pre-crisis figure, to roughly 90. So over this period of 6 years, roughly a depreciation of around 10%. Yes. The same holds more or less for the euro. So they're basically these two parts of the world see a very similar movement in real effective exchange rates. So these are exchange rate corrected for inflation differentials and take into account what the trading partners are of the individual countries. United Kingdom clearly saw a very strong depreciation during the crisis period in 2008-2009, or that part of the crisis period, and ever since has seen a rather weak pound, and also in recent times it's still, from this longer term perspective, still a weak currency. On the other side, we've seen China. China has seen a clear appreciation of its currency, not only because the Chinese central bank allowed its exchange rate to very slowly adapt, but also because the inflation dynamics in China were clearly above the inflation dynamics in many other Western countries. And as already mentioned, Japan is a case in itself. We've seen a very steep appreciation of the yen during the winter of 28-29. It basically stayed on a very high level ever since, and only very recently the depreciation efforts, which, well, are on its way, so to speak, are clearly visible in this graph as well. They are very clearly moving back to levels which we've seen before the crisis. To what extent this is real policy, or one can discuss that, but it will certainly have an effect on the Japanese economy in the upcoming periods. Inflation basically is a topic which is still there in the background, because we do observe how much money supply has increased around the world by many central banks. But if you look at the hard facts, if you look at the hard data so far, then actually world inflation had its peak in the mid of 2011 and ever since started to slow down somewhat. And during the second half of last year, the inflation rate, at least overall on the world scale, has been quite stable at around 3.2, 3.3% if you look at these kind of figures. What has been driving inflation rate in the last couple of years is mainly raw material prices. And here I take the oil price changes as an example. You can very clearly see the correlation between the blue bars and the red line. These seems to be very important factors for understanding the actual inflation rate. Whether in the medium and long term these will be the determining factors is something, of course, we can discuss. If you look at our inflation forecast, then here you see the different figures, the actual data, so to speak, and in the little table or the little column which I've put behind the names of the countries, you do observe that also in our forecast, inflation is not really going to be the issue, at least not in the short to medium run. China will see an inflation rate of 2.8%. The euro area is clearly below the 2% level. If you would even correct for particular increases in taxes which are still in the program, then hence you would look at some kind of core measure of the inflation rate, and it would be even lower. So inflation doesn't appear to be the problem according to our forecast. What has been an issue in last couple of years was, of course, developments in government bond markets, developments in financial markets more in general. And here we do observe that since September this year in particular, if you look here, for instance, the Greek the difference between the Greek long-term government bond yield and a synthetic benchmark bond yield for the euro area, you clearly see that since basically early autumn, the risk premia which the Greek had to pay is clearly falling substantially. The main reason for that are probably the ECB with their promise basically to step in case needed, in case a country is under a program, and then the ECB would consider the financial market risk premia rates to be exaggerated, and they would be willing to buy up these kinds of government bonds in the future. That promise, that backstop, so to speak, has clearly reduced tensions in these kind of markets. We not only see it for Greece, which was the left-hand scale, but we also see it for other countries, for instance, Portugal here, which you have to read on the right-hand scale. And other countries like Ireland and Spain and Italy also saw clearly a decrease in this risk premium measure since autumn this year. That also meant on the other side of the coin, so the more stable countries from this perspective saw that their negative risk premium, so to speak, or at least the difference with respect to the euro area average has been decreased somewhat. If you compare it internationally, the government bond yields, then here we observe the development of the euro area government bond yield. We've seen a year in which long-term interest rates have clearly fallen even further. They were already on historical lows, but they kept on falling throughout the year. Only this month, February, we've seen a little bit of an increase again, at least on the aggregate. For the United Kingdom, we've seen a similar development, at least in the first half of the year, but the increase already started somewhat earlier. What this picture makes clear, especially also if I draw the US into this, is that during the second half of 2011 and the first half of 2012, the difference between long-term interest rates in Europe and long-term interest rates in the rest of the world, measured here by the United States and the United Kingdom, became bigger and bigger. Yes, this for me is also a bit of a stress factor which highlights the European problems. What has happened in more recent months is that this difference has started to become somewhat smaller. And my prediction is that if the current scheme continues, meaning that if we see a further reduction in tensions, a further reduction in uncertainty, then probably the euro area long-term interest rate will more or less converge back to what we see in the US and United Kingdom. Japan is a little bit of a different case. The big issue in Europe are the government situations, the government imbalances, the government structural budget balances, so to speak. However, if you take the very international perspective, and if you look the figures from the OECD, which I do here, then actually the euro area in the aggregate is performing much better than one might expect. Probably because of the euro area being that region where financial market pressure has been very high. If you look at the United States, then since 2009, we do see a steady improvement of this measured structural budget balance, also for the upcoming year, but it's still at roughly 5% of GDP. Japan, actually the only country where we haven't seen an improvement of structural imbalances, structural budget balances. On the contrary, also the new government seems to increase its budget balance again, also from a structural sense. This is data for the United Kingdom, also a very similar picture to the United States, except for that in this year we don't expect a further improvement of the structural budget balance. And then the euro area. The euro area is clearly positioned somewhere else in this graph, although historically it seems to behave very similarly. Due to financial market pressure, at least in the aggregate, we are moving more and more close to what can be labeled a structural budget balance of close to zero. Yes. That doesn't mean that we don't have problems. On the contrary, if you look at fiscal balances per country, then we see huge differences. What this graph is showing, it's basically an idea or an attempt to get a little bit of a feeling for how much so far has been saved by the individual countries. What I'm doing here is I'm comparing, first of all, what happened during the years 2008 to 2009 with their so-called primary fiscal balance. So if I take the interest rate payments out of the picture, there you can see that basically all countries except for Hungary saw a worsening of their primary fiscal balance as compared to 2007. So this is basically comparing 2009 with 2007. That's basically what's happening here. Since 2009, of course, all countries try to get back to a better fiscal balance situation, and this blue line basically shows what the total improvement has been between 2012 and 2009. So the progress made in 2010, 2011, and 2012. Note that I'm keeping GDP fixed at the 2007 values. Yes, so it's not taken into account that the denominator might change. It is taken into account that GDP developments are affecting spending and taxes, obviously, but not the denominator here. And there we do observe that indeed some countries have actually made already quite some progress from this perspective. And if you want to split up this blue line into which years things have happened, then we can also see that there are quite some differences. Whereas Greece made most progress according to this measure in 2010, and actually we see smaller steps in the more recent years. Things are different in other countries, like for instance on the very right you see Estonia, you see countries like Sweden and Austria and Finland, where indeed most progress has been made in 2011. Coming to our growth forecast, if you look at the European Union, then first of all one has to realize that we are already clearly in a recessionary state for the European Union as a whole. And what I find most interesting to see is where this recessionary state comes from. And here I split up the growth rate itself into three components, namely domestic demand, final domestic demand, excluding the inventories, the change in inventories itself, and most importantly the foreign balances, especially the difference between export growth and import growth. Yeah, so how the net trade balance has evolved. And what this picture makes very clear is that basically any form of growth progress we've made during the last 5-6 quarters is basically coming because of an improvement of the trade balance, because export growth outperformed import growth. And the reason for that is actually shown on the next graph. Here we see how export have developed over time. And here we see how imports have developed over time. So export growth actually is not very high, but it's basically import growth which basically stopped existing. We see a very flat development in total imports if you take the European Union as a whole. This of course implied that the trade balance stepwise became bigger and bigger. Yes, and the change of this is basically the impulse for the economy. It's not so much because we are exporting more. It is a bit like that, but it's mainly because imports are so weak. If you look at the trade balance in the euro area and split it up across the different countries, then we first of all in the aggregate, we see that the trade balance is clearly in the last year improved substantially, but we can also see where it's actually coming from. And this is basically the contribution of Germany in this overall positive trade balance of the euro area now. This is not the European Union, but the euro area. And we do see that Germany has a very steady and relatively strong and large trade surplus, as you probably all are aware of. The other group of countries with an obvious trade surplus are Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, together with Austria and Finland. I aggregate these two into one group. More of interest is of course what has happened with the crisis countries, Greece, Ireland, and Portugal. And that's here the green area. They have seen clearly trade deficits in the previous years, 2006 up until 2009, but in the last couple of quarters one can clearly see that their trade deficit had overall turned into a trade surplus. Largely because imports have been falling, largely because they are in a very deep recessionary state. Similarly, these are the new euro area countries, so the Eastern European countries basically. They're in size very small, so therefore you can hardly see them. Italy is a different story. Italy, you saw it in 2010, 2011, they clearly had strong trade deficits and currently have quite recently turned that into surpluses as well. Spain, a very similar story, a country which traditionally large trade deficits is nowadays running a trade surplus, largely because imports have broken down. The country which is so far missing in this graph is France, and France actually is the country probably in that sense, in a negative sense for the future, because they've moved from being a trade surplus country into a country with a structural trade deficit, and given the competitiveness issues France is facing nowadays, that's probably something which will keep us occupied in the upcoming years. Growth forecast, well here you see our growth forecast, I already said, basically stagnation for the upcoming year, 0.1% growth rate for the European Union as a whole. For the euro area it would be minus 0.1%. You see these figures are close together. Where is the growth coming from? Well, it's a very similar story as in the last year. It's basically the external balance which is improving further and which will allow us to actually turn out, hopefully with a positive sign in front at the end of the year. The other components, so here government consumption in particular, but also the change in inventories and investment itself still will contribute negatively for total growth in Europe. The differences, of course, are large. Here you see the average for the European Union, and here you basically can see that our growth forecast for Greece is roughly minus 5%. And on the other side of the coin, we have countries like Lithuania with a plus 4%. So basically the divergence which we've seen in the last couple of years is going to continue further. We see some countries on the positive side, the robust core countries, plus some East European countries which are really catching up, also partly because they fell into a large recession in 2009. And on the other side of the coin, we see the problem countries like Greece and Portugal still in a very deep recession. Final graph I would like to show you is the unemployment rates. In our forecast, unemployment rate will, given the very weak growth, or non-growth so to speak, will actually continue to rise to an average of 12.1% this year. For the European Union, it's somewhat lower, it's 10.9%. All right, that's basically what I would like to say about the European situation and our outlook. I will now give the word to Hans-Werner Sinn, who will talk about the situation with regard to the other chapters. Probably I'll do it like this, yes.
Thanks a lot. So we have more chapters. The first chapter is always on the forecast of the macroeconomic situation, and well, no problem.
Just plug it in.
professors can also perform technical work.
Like that. And the other chapters are on special problems which change from year to year. So European imbalances and US precedents for Europe. This is what I want to talk about. There's a further chapter on labor markets, which I will not speak about. European imbalances. First of all, you see the unemployment rates. Germany, France, you know, this enormous divergence. Germany is doing much better after its own euro crisis, which you see here in 2005 when we had this peak unemployment and the Schröder reforms were carried out, basically reducing the German minimum wages implicit in the welfare state. Things improved and France moved the other direction. Germany has now less unemployment than at the peak of its last boom, and France more unemployment than at the peak of its last slump in the winter 2004-2007. I think next year's report will have to deal with France. This is Italy, this is Ireland, increasing unemployment. This is Portugal, 17%, and here are our two problematic countries, Spain and Greece. In Greece, we are in the midst of an explosion of the real economy. There's not the slightest sign in the labor market of any improvement, despite the representatives of the financial market telling us that things are improving and that we should continue pouring money at this economy. How did this all come about? You know probably this figure, but it's always good to look at it again. This is the interest rates for long-term government bonds. On the left-hand side, we have the pre-euro time. On the right-hand side, we have the crisis. At the pre-euro time, investors thought they wouldn't get their money back because the countries would inflate and depreciate. And now, in the crisis, they didn't think they get their money back because the countries default. In between, there was a short period here of 10 years when the interest rates were the same and the investors thought they would get their money back. All of this had to do with the euro, this convergence here. You see the Madrid summit when the euro was really announced to the irrevocable fixation of the interest rates. This is the conversion period, and even later when Greece joined, it also converted. This created a credit bubble in Southern Europe. The credit went into the government sector in Greece and in Portugal. It went into the construction sector in Ireland and Spain. In the end, it didn't matter where it entered, but it was a credit-driven demand, internal demand boom in these economies, which made the internal economy, the non-traded goods sector, more expensive, boosted the wages, and deprived these economies of their competitiveness. Here you see the price changes, the GDP deflator, from the Madrid summit to the Lehman crisis. And you see our crisis countries here in red have all had enormous price increases relative to Germany, which had very little price increase. Germany was in a slump. It had, because of the euro, it had the lowest net investment share in all OECD countries in this period. And if you're in a crisis with your labor market, you don't inflate, but the others were booming and had this enormous inflation. Now, the boom was, of course, what we wanted, a real adjustment, but it was overshooting. There is consensus, I think, among economists that it was overshooting and the prices increased too much. If you compare the crisis countries with the rest of the Eurozone, then they appreciated by 30% relative to them, while Germany depreciated by 22%. And this is the problem. This went way too far and changed the relative prices enormously, and this is not sustainable. So the price clock, in a sense, has to be turned backward. Those countries that inflated too much have to deflate, and Germany, which did not inflate enough, in a sense, has to inflate. Inflation is easy, deflation is painful. As a result of this increases or changes in the business situation. Germany went into a boom. The slump region always goes into an export surplus. Because of the slump, you import very little and you become cheaper relative to the others. So the exports go up, the imports stay behind, and the booming regions go into the deficit. This is the crisis countries as you see here. It had to do with these periods. So the end of the interest conversion was here in 98. Here in 2002, the euro was introduced physically in the end, and in this period, these enormous current account imbalances developed. Here is the crisis. In 2007, the interbanking market was breaking down the first time. These current account imbalances had to be financed with the capital market. The capital markets were willing to do that until 2007. Lots of private capital was flowing there. From 2007 onward, it wasn't willing to finance these differences. And so public credit flows of various kinds replaced the private capital flows. This was the Euro tango, as Mrs. Lagarde said. You may remember that. It was very important that public refinancing credit, the ECB, was available to fill the gap. When the private capital market was no longer willing to finance the current account deficits, and actual capital not only stopped flowing but reversed its direction, then the printing press, in a sense, the electronic printing press was coming in to fill the gap. And this is the target. As you see here, the target balances increasing to something like 1,000 billion euros for the gypsy countries. This was the extra refinancing credit out of local money creation made from the local central banks beyond the normal liquidity provision of these economies for the purpose of redeeming the foreign debt, replacing the interbank market, and buying the goods and services which formerly were financed with private credit that had come from abroad. So it was a money creation activity in the south. Actually, all the refinancing credit of the Eurozone comes out of these crisis countries today. Not a single euro has its origin north and west of the 6 crisis countries anymore in terms of credit operations. The money was then flowing to the north, and here there were automatic sterilizing things going on, and the money was taken out of the circuit. So in balance, the stock of money balances did not grow, even though it increased by a factor of 10 in the crisis countries, because everything was absorbed from the market again in the north. And so it's not an inflationary policy, it's just a credit policy of the ECB. The ECB was providing the credit which the market was no longer providing, and it was underbidding the market, offering the refinancing credit to the banks at more favorable conditions than the market would do it, otherwise it would not have been taken. In particular, the ECB, as you know, reduced the rating requirement for the collateral enormously, going from A- to BBB-, then taking the government bonds of the southern countries out of the credit of the rating requirement in toto, then allowing ABS paper to be used as collateral. These are the sausages which were in the center of the American crisis, where one would not really like to know what is all in it. And we did the same thing in Europe. This was the reason why Jens Weidmann, the president of the Bundesbank a year ago, wrote this nasty letter to Mario Draghi complaining about the lack of collateral, of good collateral for the refinancing credit, which showed up in these enormous target balances. By country, the whole breakdown is this. You see Germany, the Netherlands and Luxembourg and Finland are those countries where the money absorbing activities took place. These countries, basically the central banks of these countries gave the other central banks a credit. Why? Because they carried out the payments on their behalf. And the countries that took the credit are here in red bars on the right-hand side. Now, has the situation since then improved in the real economy? Let's take just two examples. Here's Greece. These are the exports, these are the imports, and you see the gap has been reduced. But it is basically a decline in imports. So the improvement in the trade balance in Greece is due to the recession in Greece, the collapse, in fact, of the economy, which implies that if people have less income, they import less, and therefore we have the improvement. It's not an improvement in competitiveness, and that is very important for what we want to say. The same for our champion, Ireland, which always had more exports than imports, but also here the improvement, the further improvement in the already good trade balance came out of reduction in imports primarily. And I could show you all the other countries, it's exactly the same. So that is our problem. The current accounts have improved in the crisis countries, but exclusively, in our view, due to the recession and the mass unemployment that resulted, and not because of structural improvement in competitiveness. In other words, we have income effects here on the trade balances and no substitution effects, but we need the substitution effects via changes in relative goods prices. We would need actually depreciation in Southern Europe. Had we a separate currency, we could do it, but we don't have it. We have the euro. And so this depreciation is the difficulty. How can we do that in principle? Cutting prices. Cutting prices, though, is difficult. This goes via austerity programs. You create a mass unemployment. You squeeze these economies. And you risk the stability of the societies, and you get a tiny little bit of price decline. That is the problem which Keynes already described in his dispute with Churchill in the 20s, when he argued that Britain should not return to the gold standard. The second possibility is we inflate the core. If Germany is inflating enough, then Greece will become competitive. The third possibility is exit and open depreciation. These are the three possibilities. There are no other possibilities. And all of these possibilities are really problematic. So Europe no longer has the choice between easy solutions. Or there is no solution. There's no easy solution. There are only painful solutions. Either we risk the stability of the southern economies through austerity programs, or we inflate Germany, which makes the Germans very nervous, I can tell you, or we have exits from the Eurozone, which with all the terrors that involves for the stability of the financial market and for this European project as such, and so on and so on. So what are the necessary realignments? Here we refer to a study by Goldman Sachs, which has just been renewed. I give you the renewed figures here. Portugal would have to cut its prices by 30% based on Q3 2010, not taking the public rescue operations into account. I mean, if you do full public rescue and you finance everything, then there's no realignment need. Greece and Spain would also have to cut their prices by 30%. France by 20%. Italy by 10%. Ireland has done it, and Germany would have to increase its prices relative to the Eurozone average by 20%. These are huge discrepancies. Even in order to make France competitive relative to Germany, we speak here about 40% change in relative prices between them. How much of these realignments of relative prices has taken place in the Eurozone? Here is the GDP deflator, according to Eurostat, relative to the respective rest of the Eurozone. And you see 100 is this point. This is the outbreak of the crisis in 2007. Since then, or up to then, Spain inflated relative to its competitors. Now it deflated, but not very much, 1.5%. Where would they have to go? There, quite a long way. This is Portugal. That's what they have done, 1% real devaluation in nearly 6 years of crisis. And they would have to go here. This is Greece. Okay, one can qualify these data insofar as there was a little bit of increase in indirect taxes, but even without that, you know, you don't get a major change in Greece. This is France. That's where they would have to go. Of course, how can they go there in the Eurozone? By inflating less than Germany. So Mr. Hollande will have to make an austerity program. Only austerity programs will reduce a country's inflation rate. There's no other possibility. This is Italy. Well, there's one other possibility I will speak about, a fiscal devaluation, but apart from that, this is Italy. This is Ireland. Ireland doesn't have to devalue anymore. It did it already. And this is Germany. It would have to go up here. So if we keep the average European price level constant, say at the level here in the middle, then Germany would have to inflate by 20%, say in the next 10 years, 2% inflation, but France would have to deflate by 2% per year. If we want to avoid the deflation in France and keep the French price level constant, then Germany would have to inflate by about 50%, 4.1% per year. If we wanted to keep the Spanish price level constant and do everything via the inflation of the rest, then Germany would have to inflate by more than 5% per year. And after 10 years, its price level would have to increase by 71%, implying that its nominal claims determined in euro would go down in real terms by 42%. So these are enormous requirements in the Eurozone. And as you see, very little has been achieved thus far. The only country that did it was Ireland. The Irish price level from 2006 to 2011 already came down by 15%. Actually, there was a little bit of overshooting in Ireland, and the Irish current account has strongly improved. Why Ireland? Well, I guess it is because Ireland was standing alone when the crisis came. There was no one helping Ireland, no particular refinancing programs of the ECB. Actually, until 2008, the refinancing credit of Ireland was just normal. There was no target balances until then, only later. And also, of course, there were no intergovernmental rescue programs. So the Irish had to do it themselves. They carried out the austerity programs. Their wages declined in a two-digit manner, and their prices, and they did it. The other European countries came into crisis simultaneously after Lehman, and then they thought they better choose another possibility, and they basically used the printing press to solve their financial needs. And then later, when Trichet became nervous about that, also the intergovernmental rescue programs from May 2010 onwards. But as much as these programs help with overcoming the financial needs, they slow down, obviously, the necessary adjustment because they are the opposite of the austerity program. So, the conclusion, major realignments of relative prices are inevitable in the Eurozone, but they would be it would have to be more extreme than in Ireland. Because Ireland was not that far away from its equilibrium prices as the others. Euro area periphery countries might also slightly improve their competitiveness by undertaking a fiscal devaluation. What is a fiscal devaluation? It means that you reduce the direct taxes, in particular the employers' contributions to Social Security and these things, and at the same time you compensate with an increase in the VAT, because the VAT is taken away for exports. It doesn't harm exports and competitiveness. Unfortunately, we are talking here about the Latin Roman countries, which traditionally have already very high VAT rates and very little direct taxation, so they, in a sense, don't have the leeway for major reforms in this direction. But still, theoretically, it would be a possibility. Definitely it goes via austerity, so everyone has to reduce the government deficits, and we argue it would be better to cut expenditure rather than increase taxes, because then the demand cut would be larger and you would get a stronger effect on relative prices. In the end, we believe that some countries cannot repay their debt, therefore there should be haircuts. The debt, there should be debt relief on a large scale. But, of course, not at the expense of the taxpayer, but at the extent or at the expense of the owners of credit titles. So bail-ins rather than bail-outs. The last chapter refers to the United States of America. In America, we had a very difficult and turbulent initial time, out of which reforms came that created the America of today. And in America, we also had a gradual process towards creation of the Federal Reserve System. Actually, still in the 19th century, for more than 100 years when the dollar existed, there wasn't the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System was only founded in 1914. Before that, the target balances were settled with gold. If one bank asked another to carry out a payment on its behalf, and there wasn't a reverse transaction, then the bank asking the other had to settle the difference with gold. No? If I ask another bank to pay out money to a customer, a client, because this client is supposed to ship some good to my client, then I have to pay with gold. So gold settling was always the American solution, but that was dangerous because the gold had to be transported in space. You know that from the Wild West movies when the stagecoach was transporting the gold. And then in 1914, the Americans said, let's do it different. Let's put the gold on one pile and just reallocate the ownership titles in the gold. That lasted until shortly after the death of the Bretton Woods system, 1975. And from then on, the settlement was done with handing over ownership titles in the clearing portfolio, in the open market portfolio, which the Fed acquires in its money provision activities. So this is the target balances in the Eurozone. Oh, you cannot easily see that here, but it's only, it's not necessary to look to the single curves, but you see this is quite a divergence. Some are in deficit, others are in the positive range. And here you see the same for America. Also huge differences, but the difference is more clearer to be seen if we sum up these, the gross target balances in the United States, net they are 0, and relate that to GDP. That gives this curve. And here you see that at the settlement point in time, April every year, the target balances go down. They go down actually before that. Why before that? Because those district feds that created more money than would be appropriate according to their size know that they would be punished by handing over marketable assets, And they wanted to avoid that. Thereby, they reduced the money creation, increasing the local interest rate, implying that there would be a capital import from other regions, bringing down the target balances. Actually, here in 2011, they postponed the settlement for 1 year, but you know, after that, the settlement took place. And this is the European curve by comparison, relative to the Eurozone GDP. We simply lack a settlement system. It's a construction mistake in the Euro system that you can buy goods and assets in other countries and redeem your private debt just putting the numbers on an account, a book account, where they are carried forward from 1 year to the next with a rate of interest of currently only 0.75%. The lack of securitization of the target balances is, in our opinion, the construction mistake in the Euro system. And we advocate to mimic the American system, adopt their rules here. The second lesson we learned from the United States is about debt mutualization. We find that debt mutualization is dangerous. Many people say debt mutualization is a peace-producing operation for Europe. The American president shows the opposite is true. This is Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton had mutualized the debt of the single states in America in 1791, arguing that this debt arose from the war against the Brits after becoming independent, and since it was for a common purpose, it could well be mutualized. Then there was another debt mutualization in the Second War against Great Britain in 1813, and so these debt mutualization activities created the expectation for the single states that it wouldn't be a problem if you borrow, because the burden of the debt would be shared by everyone. And you would make a mistake in your own country if you did not borrow while everyone else is borrowing. So they borrowed to build canals, infrastructure investment, not all very efficient. Some canals were never used, you know, there was the money. A big credit bubble developed in the United States of America, which burst in 1838. And in the period from 38 to 42, there was a big crisis in America, driving more than half of the American states into bankruptcy until 42, within these 4 years. And the other states were close to bankruptcy. So after that, there was a lot of hassle and strife. It was not a peacekeeping operation. As we say in the report, the Hamiltonian scheme of federal finance did not guarantee a peaceful Commonwealth. In fact, the fiscal union proved to be an explosive rather than a cement, as Hamilton had thought. So our conclusion is Europe should introduce a mechanism to settle the target balances, also to reduce the incentives to solve the credit problems with a local money printing press. And second, after the creation of the United States of Europe, after this creation, with a common army and a common government, Europe needs a common tax base, a common central government, and a common budget. But the sequencing is right. You cannot begin with a common tax base and the government and the fiscal union. You have to end with it after you create the state, the United States of Europe. And we strongly advocate that Europe moves this direction. Even if you do that, though, as the Americans have done it, you should not mutualize your old debt. It's like in a marriage. Whatever wealth you bring into the marriage remains the ownership or burden of the respective partners. Because debt mutualization is a recipe to create hassle and strife. If I may add a little bit beyond the report, I think this is the biggest problem of what we are doing. Currently, think of the banks and their creditors. The banks cannot often repay. It's a private debtor-creditor relationship. If we, through using the ESM money, shift this private debtor-creditor relationship to the public arena, we take it out of the range of civil law, which would be a resolution mechanism, and put it to some other dimension where the credit conditions, the repayment operations, and all these things become subject to a dispute between countries. And that is a risky operation for Europe. Thank you.
Okay, you have had a very thorough presentation which started with the very short-term economic outlook and then ended in a grand design of a European superstate about which nobody in Brussels dares to even dream. But maybe Anne Boucher has some more specific comments. The floor is yours.
Okay, I understand I have very little time, so I won't go into the explanations. I think I advise you to read the report. I mean, the report is much more qualified than what we've heard, but I mean, I think I need to respond to a couple of the points, and I will not go in details in the explanation because I have not much time, but there are some statements which I think need to be challenged, and I think, I mean, I suppose you would also challenge them. I will focus on the issue of imbalances and the final issue on how inspiring the US model should be for the euro area. Yeah? On the first issue of imbalances, I think, I mean, we should stop this controversy that target is a sign of imbalance. Target, it reflects the fact that in the monetary union, liquidities are issued by national central banks, but the fact to have access to the banking sector, the role of a central bank is to provide liquidity to the banking sector. The limit is the collateral. We heard that the collateral policy has been, I mean, relaxed beyond what is acceptable. We wouldn't be in a situation where we have managed to reduce the risk of disintegration of the euro area and restore cross-border lending if the collateral policy of the ECB had been outrageous. So, I mean, that's one point. The second point where I want also to say, to be very firm on the position which is taken in the report, in which one of the points where I feel the most uneasy with is the fact that internal devaluation is the only way forward for the periphery, and internal devaluation in the sense of wage adjustment. Wage adjustment is part of the overall correction of imbalances, true. You need to correct for the excessive wage increases, excessive in the sense of above productivity, which happened in the last decade. But there's also a real growth and productivity story in the adjustment. There is a whole issue of restoring, I mean, changing the relative prices between tradables and non-tradables. And the excessive wage increases and price increases have mainly been in the non-tradable sector. So this is something which needs to be corrected, and that's why we cannot take just the wage adjustment as calculated by Goldman Sachs as what is necessary, because it only reflects part of the story. The other part of the story is mainly that the reduction, the increase in competitiveness will come from reallocation across sectors, productivity gains, and a shift towards more productive firms or more productive sectors. I also have to challenge the fact that a lot of the that what has happened so far is purely cyclical. I don't think it's true. I mean, I don't want to go into the details, but what we see on export, on import compression, on reduction of the public sector, reduction of the construction sector in the periphery, are really structural adjustment, and they're not cyclical, even if I agree the adjustment is fairly slow. Yeah, I mean, you see in the periphery a very strong reduction in unit labor cost. This comes from productivity gains and labor shedding, and our concern is that the kind of positive story through the reallocation and through the emergence of growing firms, more productive firms, is not fully there, and this is not because these countries are not competitive. It is mainly the result of the deleveraging process and the fact that there's a weak internal demand because of deleveraging, and that because also of deleveraging you have lending restrictions and high financing costs, which make it difficult for new firms to emerge here. And that's why the banking reform, the recapitalizations are so important for the success of the current adjustment. I also would like, I mean, on the very last aspect, I mean, I would like also to say, I mean, on the rebalancing, one final point, which I think it's not the internal devaluation which will make it. Part of the solution, there should be a contribution from the core. And this contribution is not only in the sense of a symmetric adjustment by increasing wages and domestic demand in Germany. We've just issued a study on looking at the current account surplus. What it shows is that financial interlinkages are much more important than the trade linkages. And what you need is to make sure that the downhill capital which existed before the crisis are restored, but what you need to make sure that the downhill capital from the core to the periphery, I mean, take place and are directed towards productive uses instead of feeding housing bubbles or growth of the public sector. And that's what you need. And for that, it is precisely what you get through the banking union and a common supervision, which ensures that there's proper lending criteria. What you also need is through the competitiveness to ensure that at some stage, the excess saving in Germany or in other surplus countries would take the form of foreign direct investment in the periphery, and that would, this type of capital flows would avoid that the debt of the periphery increases. So the story, I mean, it's not only what I'm pointing to is that it is not only a story of internal devaluation to correct the imbalances, it is not only a story of decreasing wages. I won't go too much because, I mean, I think I have to finish, but I mean, I also, just to say that the way, I mean, and if you look at the proposals which are being discussed with the, in the European Council, the issue of moral hazard linked to debt mutualization are very much present in the heads of all our policymakers. And if you look at the sequence which is being chosen with banking union as a priority, with the fact that we would more go for Euro bills in the very short term, I mean, this type of proposals really show that there's not I mean, that the proposal is not for right away a mutualization of debt at the EU level without counterpart of strengthening political commitment and having some experience of some fiscal capacity. I also have, but I won't go into this, I think the issue of the settlement is again a misperception on the role of target in the euro area, and that the argument which is made in the report that the US settlement system would in fact protect creditors in case of a breakup of the Eurozone is not true. But I mean, I don't have time to go more in the explanations. Thanks.
We have a resource problem here. Time-wise, we have run seriously over time. We have exactly 5 minutes left. Let me first check whether there are some very urgent questions in the public. Anybody wants to address a question to our presenters immediately? Okay, very briefly, 1 and 2.
To Professor Sinn, I agree with your analysis broadly. You several times referred to France and the imbalances, and I think you're right. Why is it that the financial markets have not yet acted or reacted sufficiently to signal to France and to the world that this is unlikely to be balanced and acceptable, and now France is able to continue to drag with its necessary austerity measures and otherwise, and reforms? Now, I know you cannot change financial markets, but do you agree that that is a missing link, not in the economic analysis, but in the behavior or non-behavior of the private sector financial markets?
Over there.
I was a little bit puzzled about your story, Irish story. I don't see why Ireland is so different from the other one, why Ireland is a standing alone country. If you can explain this a little bit more. And then on the allocation, but the misallocation of resources before the crisis, and the fact that there was a huge amount of credit that was allocated in the wrong sectors. Now here my question is, was there a sort of crowding out? So resources were invested in the wrong sectors and not enough in the right ones, or just the fact that there was an excessive allocation in some specific sectors? Thanks.
Okay, perhaps I give the two presenters some minutes to reply. Would you like to answer?
Yeah. Well, let me go in reverse. Ireland, here you see it. I mean, why Ireland is so different, I don't know. But Ireland came earlier into crisis. In 2006, the house price bubble burst. And Ireland was the very first country to be affected. And the other countries came after Lehman, so 2 years later. And these 2 years make the difference, because no one was helping Ireland. The ECB was not willing to accept any EEAG credit, any special credit provision. The target balances in Ireland were zero in 2007, flat.
And later Ireland did get...
Yeah, later, but the first 2 years they got nothing. And that was already the time when they went into austerity programs. So Ireland just started 2 years before the others. And before these official rescue programs were there, and therefore they had to do the job themselves. France, this is really a puzzle. France is in rather bad shape. France has de-industrialized. Its manufacturing share in GDP is just 9%, below the British one, less than half of Germany's, and the trend is steeply going downward. France definitely does have a competitiveness problem. They used to compensate for the lack of jobs with expanding the government sector. The government share in GDP is now the highest or second highest in the OECD countries. Also, twice as many people are in the government sector than in Germany. But they have used up their powder. So France will face a serious competitiveness problem, which will occupy us for the next few years. Still, the question is why the financial markets don't show that in the spreads. I would say because France is beyond doubt in terms of financial solidity. After all, they have a very strong state. They have a very powerful position in the Eurozone. So investors seem to believe that through one channel or another they will get their money back, despite the real economy problems in France. Then the question was, Mrs. Boucher said, we don't have to do everything through wage cuts. We can do it through productivity increases. Yes, I fully agree. And actually this here is not wages. This is goods prices, GDP deflator, relative to the rest. One way of bringing the GDP deflator down would be wage cuts. Another would be, given the wages, to increase the productivity. And so you're perfectly right. We don't have to have wage cuts. It would be enough if we have sufficient productivity increases and keep the wages constant. But it should be clear when politicians speak about reforms, productivity increases and so on, one should not forget that all these measures operate only if and to the extent that they really reduce the GDP deflator, the price level, because that's the analog to an open depreciation. Either they result in such a depreciation, then there is an improvement in competitiveness, or they do not result in such a depreciation, and then we have a problem, and that is what is shown here. And then you made a remark on the capital flows. You said the capital should continue to flow from north to south, except not into the construction sector, but into better uses. Well, I doubt that. I think enough has already flown, because by definition, the capital flow to a country is equal to the current account deficit. So if we want to rebalance the Eurozone by reducing the current account deficits and surpluses, then we have to reduce the capital flows. It is a logically impossible statement to say, and I hear that very often here in Brussels. I did hear that from Ms. Lagarde, that we need more rescue operations, we need to escort the capital from the north to the south, and at the same time we have to reduce the current account imbalances. This is a thing of impossibility, because they are the same thing, just seen from another perspective.
When I see these graphs, I always ask myself, if I take it 10 years back, 1998, then if people then had calculated, and I think some did, maybe you yourself, the need for Germany to regain competitiveness, many people were very doubtful then that Germany could ever regain necessary competitiveness within a monetary union, given that it entered with such an overvalued exchange rate. Remember vaguely title of one of your books, which was that can Germany still be saved? Now, the adjustment did happen, took a long time. It did happen with basically stable prices within the euro area.
Wage cuts, exactly what the book argued.
The question is, if it was possible to do it once in one direction, why should it not be possible to do basically the reverse movement over the next 10 or 50 years in the other direction?
Of course it is possible. I do think it is possible to get a realignment in the Eurozone. It does involve a lot of inflation in Germany. It does involve a little bit of deflation and austerity in the southern countries. I believe for some countries the path, though, will be too burdensome, and they will exit voluntarily before this is achieved. You will read my lips and ask yourself 10 years from now what I've said. But still, I think it is possible. Germany showed that 22% real devaluation within 13 years' time is possible. No? But our advantage was, first, that we were never doubted by the capital market. Germany was always liquid. And second, we were confronted with southern countries that liked and were used to inflate. So the advantage of Germany was that in the south there were all these countries that had huge inflation rates in the past and just continued to inflate even though we had the euro. Now we have the reverse thing. Now the south has to do the real devaluation, and Germany will not be kind enough to inflate that easily. It will be much more difficult to inflate Germany than Greece in the past. And that is the fundamental difficulty. If we really inflate Germany sufficiently to make Greece competitive, I tell you there will be, no German government will survive that. The people still have a complex here from the big inflation from 1915 to 23, which deprived the German Mittelstand of all its wealth and made them radical.
The regaining of competitiveness by Germany was achieved with an average inflation rate for the euro as a whole of exactly 2%. So it was possible to go one way with an average of 2% in one direction. If you keep the same average going forward, that would mean that at the end of the adjustment period, the average inflation rate of the entire period for Germany would also have been 2%. Below 2% in the first 10, 12, 13 years, and above 2% in the ensuing 13 or whatever years.
Yeah, but
so the average over the entire period can still be 2%, which would still be better than the Bundesbank period beforehand.
No, you know what is the mistake in your calculation? The debt which has been built up in the meantime. So we do not even have to return the clock to where it was, but more in order to generate current account surpluses. And this is the way how Goldman Sachs calculated this. The point is not what do we have to do to regain competitiveness. To be precise, what they calculated is what do we have to do to bring the net foreign asset position below 25% of GDP. And all this extra debt that had been piled up in the meantime makes the difficulty. For Spain in particular, this is the problem. And this is the reason why in their calculation, Italy will not have to devalue that much. They have very little foreign debt.
Okay, that's what I wanted to bring out. So what, because the things you're presenting imply that over the next years, the Southern European countries should run huge current account surpluses, right? We can discuss whether that is optimal or not, whether financial markets will require it or not, but just to have a sustainable position, it's different. Sustainable position would just mean that they could generate a current account, perhaps equilibrium, whereby the interest payments are enough to keep the debt level constant. Whether it's optimal, sustainable, we don't know, but that would be sufficient, and that of course would require a much lower adjustment need. But about these adjustment needs, I know from the past, one can discuss ad infinitum. Different people have always different numbers. That has always been the past.
But I'll give you another number. Greece is 64% more expensive than Turkey. Turkey is a good comparison because they have a flexible exchange rate, so the market determines the exchange rate. They have the same water, the same temples, the same food. How can they be 64% more expensive? In order to come down to the price level of Turkey, Greece would have to cut, everything else equal, its prices by 39%.
Or the Turkish lira would have to go up by 60%, but we leave it at this point. We have run a bit over time. I want to thank you for your patience. I know that there are some people in the room who would like to have some individual question and answer session with our presenters. Please come up to the podium right now. That's the occasion. Thank you very much.